Now let's talk with Randall Balmer. Randall, thank you for joining us today. And
my pleasure.
A beautiful message about inclusiveness and standing up for the other in our midst. We're grateful for that. And I want to say I'm intrigued by your most recent book and would like to spend a little time talking about the making of evangelicalism. My evangelical friends always talk about the attraction to the faith experience is the relevancy and the communication aspect. And you speak to this in a really interesting way from a historical point of view. So I wonder if you could start by talking about that a little bit.
Sure.
In the tradition.
I think the genius of evangelicalism throughout American history, and it is in many ways a peculiarly American phenomenon. There are other places in the world that have it, but evangelicalism in America, I think, is particular to the United States in some ways. But the genius of it is the ability of evangelicals to speak the idiom of the culture, no matter what they might be. When we did the documentary, Mine Eyes Are Seeing the Glory, we opened in Willow Creek, up in South Barrington, Illinois, for example. And it's a perfect example of how you speak to the surrounding culture, how you speak the idiom of the culture, using the language of corporate America, for example, using expressions and ideas, but also programs that will appeal to suburbanites and their tastes. But this is a long tradition. George Whitefield, one of the most famous preachers in American history, the apostle of the Great Awakening, had been trained in the London theater. So he understood the importance of the dramatic gesture and using a stentorian voice and dramatic pauses and so forth. And in a tradition that had, at that time, no theatrical life, no theatrical tradition. He was enormously successful. Contemporaries said he could bring tears to your eyes simply by saying Mesopotamia. But throughout American history, there are more and more examples. Right here in Chicago, D.L. Moody at Moody Church, what's now named Moody Church, it wasn't then, a wonderful example of speaking the idiom of the culture, and that's what evangelicals do better than anybody else.
You started giving serious scholarly attention to the evangelical movement back in the 80s. What motivated you to turn your scholarship in that direction?
I'm really trained as a colonial historian. In many ways, that's still my love and my passion. But I just started teaching at Columbia in 1985, and shortly thereafter, the televangelist scandals began to break. And I'm sure that a lot of folks will remember this when Jim Baker had a tryst with, and we can't make this up, a church secretary from Long Island, and Jimmy Swaggart was caught in Louisiana motel rooms engaged in some sort of voyeuristic activity. Oral Roberts declared that God would call him home unless God's people ponied up several $1 million and so forth. And I mean, a lot of it was entertaining, I have to say, and the media got a kick out of it. But I guess I was distressed at the tone of the media coverage. The media seemed to think that all evangelicals were the moral equivalent of Jim Baker or Jimmy Swaggart. And as somebody who grew up as an evangelical, who was intimately familiar with the movement, and also somebody who had studied American religious history, I thought I could offer a different perspective. And so I got this crazy idea at the time to travel around the country and visit evangelicals at the grassroots. And then the book, Mine Eyes Are Seeing the Glory, came out of that, and then the three-part documentary.
So what do you think the perception is today of modern evangelicals? You talk about the 80s idea. It's evolved with megachurches in many cases. What does someone who's not an evangelical think about evangelicals? I
think it's a very good question. I think what I've noticed in my lifetime is how much it's changed. Now, I grew up within what I call the evangelical subculture in the 50s and 60s. And we were very much aware of ourselves as being a subculture, that is being a people apart from the rest of the world. And we were also a counterculture. We understood ourselves as being different from the rest of the world, and there was we took a pride in that. That was a matter of real substance, that we were not worldly. And the most damning thing you could say about a fellow believer was that she or he was worldly in the 50s and 60s. That changed dramatically, I think, I can almost pinpoint at least the year, 1980, it changes. When evangelicals become involved in politics in a big way, they help with the election of Ronald Reagan, which is very significant in all sorts of ways. So my sense is that after 1980, evangelicalism still is a subculture, but it's no longer a counterculture. And that's a very, very different feel, very different understanding of the entire movement. So I think other folks look at evangelicals and they say, these folks they're savvy, they know how to do communications. You know, look at Sarah Palin, for example, as just one recent example. And they're politically adroit, but they're no longer countercultural in the way that I was certainly growing up.
Briefly, love to hear a little bit about your journey. You were raised evangelical. When I met you a few years ago, you were preparing for ordination as an Episcopal priest. Yeah. What's happened since then?
Well, I love being a priest. I still consider myself an evangelical, although I'm careful to distance myself politically from what most people think of that movement. But I love preaching. I love celebrating the sacraments. My wife and I are just part-time priests in a small country church in Connecticut near where we live, and I love it. It in many ways has kind of completed me in ways that I never could have understood 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. And I'm also convinced of the importance of the sacraments, and this is something that is different from my childhood. I was introduced to the Episcopal Church really when I was in grad school at Princeton, and we lived a couple of blocks away from Trinity Church in Princeton, and I just wandered in one Sunday, and I felt like I'd come home. First of all, the building itself said something important happens here, and I wasn't sure what it was, but something important happens there, unlike the kind of warehouse stuff that too often, I'm afraid, is characteristic of evangelical churches. But also the fact that the Eucharist, the sacrament, was at the center of the worship and the liturgy was, for me, a very important moment. Preaching is wonderful, but preaching can become theatrical, it can become over the top. And I'm very careful in my preaching. I believe firmly the sermon should never overshadow the main event of the worship, which for me is the Eucharist.
Well, we're glad that you brought your preaching to us today.